Hey, what's up, Econ kids? Welcome back to the Econ Survival Guide. This is Coach Desharlais. I hope everybody's having a great day today. Today we're going to be starting Unit 3, Macroeconomics. And we're going to be starting today with lesson number 1, about GDP. When we start to think about what economics are, macroeconomics is all about the study of the economy as a whole. In our last unit, you were looking at microeconomics, which is the study of the small different parts of the economy. Now, we're going to build on some of the ideas that we learned in Unit 1. And in Unit 1, we understood that there were 3 basic economic goals, no matter what type of economy you were in. Those 3 basic economic goals were steady growth, stable prices, and full employment. Today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at that first goal of all economies. And that first goal of all economies is to promote steady growth. It's all about the gains. Now, the biggest question that economists have to deal with when looking at steady growth is how do we exactly measure economic growth? Now, to do this, we're going to be looking at GDP. GDP and the types of GDP are how a country measures its economic growth. So one of the things that we've been talking about in society in general at the time I'm making this video here in 2020 is really just how well our country economically is doing. And when we start to think about that, is our economy doing well? Is it doing poorly? One of the things that we can look at is we can look at several different statistics. We can look at statistics on the production, on family incomes. We can look at investments and things like the stock market. We can look at savings. How much does the average American have saved up? However, the most important thing that any economist is going to look at when we're looking at how much we're growing or how little we're growing is what's known as GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it's defined as the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's border in one particular year. Now, we can look at a few of those different aspects of the definition. We want to get into that just a little bit here. So the first one is dollar value. Now, we should understand that GDP is measured in US dollars. So just the total value of things. The other thing that we want to look at is final goods and final services as well. And GDP does not calculate the value of what we call intermediate goods. An intermediate good is any good that's created in the process of making a final good. So for instance, let's say you have a car company, the value of the car is what's counted towards GDP. But let's say you own a parts company that supplies parts to make that car. What you're making doesn't count towards GDP because what you're making goes into the car, which then gets counted towards GDP. And so that intermediate good doesn't get counted. Finally, GDP is calculated on a yearly basis, so the annual economic performance of a country. Now, generally speaking, GDP is made up of 4 parts, and there are 4 components to GDP. And they are, first of all, consumer spending. And that's what you and me spend whenever we go out. So for instance, we spend $5 on a Little Caesars pizza, we buy something off of Amazon, anything like that. That's all just consumer spending. It's our daily spending that we create on a daily, weekly, monthly, and even yearly basis. The second type is what we call investments. Now, investments is not if you buy stock in, let's say, Google or Amazon or really any other company. Really what it means is it's when a business puts money back into their own business. So for instance, if they buy new machinery or new tools, a really good example of this is this past year, Mr. Holzenbeck made some major investments in his business. He bought a new truck for his business. He bought some new mowers. All of those are investments and would be counted towards the GDP of the United States. The third type is government spending. So this could be anything that the government is spending money on that is the creation of new goods and services. So for example, if we're buying new bombs or tanks, or the government builds a new building or pays for the building of a roadway, that's all government spending. Now, Social Security or anything where just a person receives a check and they haven't created anything, that does not count. Those are just called transfer payments. Finally, net exports. So that's the amount of goods and services we are exporting minus the value of everything that we are importing. Now, currently, we have a net export number that is negative because we import more than we export. In total, the GDP formula is here: C plus I plus G plus X of N. That is the consumer spending, investments, government spending, and net exports is our total calculation for GDP. So when we think about how do we use GDP, it's very much kind of like we calculate our own income. Essentially, it tells us how well financially the United States is doing. And we can kind of look at this over previous years. So for instance, we could compare this year to last year. All right, do we have more GDP this year than we had last year? Well, it kind of tells us that, we're growing, just kind of like you would use it with your own income. Did I make more money than I did last year? Well, if I did, then I'm probably doing fairly well. I could also ask myself, did a certain policy work? If, for instance, if there was a government policy to, let's say, cut taxes under President Trump, for instance, did GDP increase? Well, if it increased, it might suggest that that new policy worked. If it decreased, it might, or didn't improve, it might suggest that the policy didn't work. Finally, we can also compare one country to another who has more GDP. Typically, if you have more GDP, that means you're probably better off than other countries. So, for instance, we can look at this set of GDP numbers. Now, this is from 2010. It's a little bit old, but we can see that the United States has $14 trillion in GDP. China, about 10 billion or 10 trillion. The entire European Union is almost 15 trillion, Japan, etc., etc. And what this tells us is that the United States is probably better off than most of those other countries on there because our GDP is much, much higher. However, there are some things that are not included in GDP, and it's as important to know what's not included as what's included in GDP. So, for instance, things that are not included in GDP are, like I've mentioned before, intermediate goods. These are things that are used in the making of other goods. And if you count them, you would essentially be double counting those items. So we only include the final price of those goods and services. So we include the price of the finished, fully put together car, not the car and the price of the radio and the stereo system, the tires, etc., etc. It's just the entire car one time. Other things that are not included are non-production transactions. And there's two different types. The first type is financial transactions, and nothing's produced here. You're just trading money for essentially pieces of paper. So stocks, bonds, real estate, for instance, all of these are financial transactions, and nothing new is created, just ownership is transferred. And so they therefore don't count towards GDP because you're not making anything new. The other type of thing, of non-production transactions, are used goods. Used goods don't count towards GDP. Now, they did count towards GDP when they were new and in the year in which they were made. And since, once again, we can't count things multiple times, like we talked about just at the top of this slide, we also can't count used goods because we've already counted them once. So things such as used cars, used clothing, anything like that, all used goods cannot be counted. Finally, non-market or illegal activities don't get counted towards GDP, although some economists argue that they should be. This could be, for instance, illegal drugs, any really unpaid work of, any type, all of these things are not counted towards GDP. However, there are some problems, though, with GDP. Let me run you through an example to show you one of the problems with GDP. So let's think about this. Let's think about how could we figure out the most popular movie of all time. Well, one of the things that we could look at is we could look at the total amount of money spent by moviegoers to watch that movie. Now, the one that wins hands down is Avengers Endgame. It had nearly $3 trillion of worldwide gross sales. It's followed closely after by Avatar, Titanic, Star Wars The Force Awakens, Infinity War, Jurassic Park. You see the list there. And in many ways, this kind of correlates to GDP. You're like, okay, wow, Avengers Endgame must be the most popular movie of all time. But there might be a problem with this particular method. Notice the year. Just even within that. The Avengers Endgame was 2019. Titanic's number 3 on the list, but it was made over 20 years ago. Was there movies that may be more popular that are even older than that? Well, let's think about it. How much do you think a movie ticket was back in 1997? I'll give you a hint. It was cheaper. What about back in the 1980s or 70s, 60s? Were movie tickets cheaper? Would that skew that worldwide gross number? So what can we do that would maybe make it a better method? Well, what we could look at is we could look at what we're called real box office receipts. Now, real box office receipts takes and adjusts for inflation. So what you would do is you would take the movie ticket price for, let's say, Gone with the Wind in 1939, and you would make it equivalent to what a person today would pay for a movie. Well, if you did that, this are the new numbers here. You see, Gone with the Wind, if it was produced in 2019 with 2019 ticket prices, would have $3.7 trillion in sales. So here's the problem with GDP. GDP can be misleading. For instance, right? If a country's GDP increases from $4 to $5 billion in a year, are they experiencing economic growth? Did they definitely produce 25% more products? Or maybe things just became more expensive. It could be because of inflation, a general level of the increase in prices. So for example, if apples are the only thing being produced, in year 1, if you produce 10 apples at $1 each, you have a GDP of $10. In year 2, if the price is $1.25, GDP is $12.50. Well, GDP is rising, but the country's worse off. Why is that? Well, the country's worse off because people are having to pay more money for apples. That's not really a good thing. Therefore, this idea of nominal GDP, just the GDP in current prices, doesn't account for inflation from year to year. Instead, what we should use is what is called real GDP. This expresses GDP in constant, unchanging dollars and adjusts previous year's numbers to today's actual numbers. And it adjusts for inflation, and therefore is the best measure of economic growth. Well, let's go ahead and see how much we understand the content by answering a few multiple choice questions. Our first one says, which best describes GDP? On this one, your answer should have been B. It measures how much is produced in an economy in a given time period. Our second question, which items are added together to get gross domestic product? For this one, you should have selected D, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Finally, a shoe produced in South Korea and sold in the United States. For this one, you should have said included in South Korea's GDP. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Until next time, and as always, go Pack.